They called it shell shock. A weak, almost comforting term, it suggested a physical cause, the concussion of an exploding shell. Something external, mechanical, understandable, a wound like any other. It was a lie. What was happening inside the minds of men in the trenches was not mechanical. It was metaphysical. It was the human psyche shaped for millennia to face sudden, acute danger, breaking under the weight of a new reality. Chronic, industrialized terror. This was not a wound to the body. It was a wound to the story of the self. A fundamental fracture in the human being's relationship with time, safety, and meaning. The Great War invented a new category of human experience. Before it, madness was considered inheritance or moral failing. After it, the world had to confront a terrifying truth, that you could destroy a mind without leaving a single mark on the flesh, that civilization itself could be a pathogen. The environment was the weapon. Consider the sensory universe of a frontline soldier. It was a world without silence. The artillery barrage was not an event, it was the atmosphere. A constant, vibrating roar that could last for days, shuddering through the ground, through the walls of dugouts, through the sternum and teeth. Men lost their hearing. They stopped being able to distinguish the sound of an incoming shell, the skill that meant life or death. The noise became a solid thing, a prison. It was a world without sight of the enemy. In previous wars you saw the man you killed. You faced him. In the trenches, death was faceless, random, and delivered from miles away. A man could be vaporized by a shell he never heard. A sniper's bullet could come from nowhere. This anonymous killing created a profound, eerie dissonance. The act of war was stripped of all personal context, all ritual, all even the grim satisfaction of confrontation. It was a world of radical confinement. The trench was a sunless ditch, a labyrinth of mud and rotting timber. To raise your head above the parapet was to risk instant death. The horizon was reduced to a few yards of filthy sandbags. This physical constriction mirrored a psychological one. There was no forward, no backward, only an eternal, claustrophobic present of waiting. And it was a world of intimate putrefaction. Men lived with the dead. They shared their trenches with swollen, rat-gnawed corpses. They drank water filtered through soil churned with human remains. The stench of decay was the smell of home. The boundary between the living and the dead, the clean and the unclean, dissolved. This was not a temporary hardship. This was a permanent state. Men rotated from front line to support line to reserve line and back again for months, for years. There was no escape, only varying degrees of proximity to the abyss. The human nervous system is not designed for this. It is designed to face a tiger, to flood with adrenaline, to fight or flee, and then to return to safety, to process, to rest. The trenches offered no safety, no release, no processing. The adrenaline pump was stuck in the on position until the mechanism burned out. The symptoms were a language of shattered nerves. Men froze. Literally. They would be found catatonic in a dugout, curled into a fetal position, staring at nothing, unreachable. This was the mind's ultimate retreat, a withdrawal from a reality too terrible to inhabit. Men shook. Uncontrollable tremors, a violent palsy that made them useless as soldiers. It was as if the constant vibration of the earth had been absorbed into their very muscles. Men lost functions. They went blind, though their eyes were unharmed. They went mute, though their vocal cords were intact. They became paralyzed, though their spines were sound. These were hysterical conversions, the mind, unable to express its terror in words, expressing it through the body's betrayal. A mute man was not refusing to speak. His mind had concluded that in a world of such screaming horror, speech itself was meaningless. Men were haunted. They jumped at the slamming of a door. They dove under tables at the backfire of a car. The war had rewired their danger responses. The world of peace had become permanently contaminated with the triggers of the front. Doctors were baffled. Military command was often furious. This looked like cowardice. It smelled of malingering. The 19th century mind believed in willpower, in grit. That a man could be psychologically disabled without a physical wound was an affront to the entire culture of martial masculinity. The treatment was often barbaric. The Kaufmann cure in Germany involved brutal electric shocks applied to the most sensitive parts of the body, a form of torturous aversion therapy. Your fear of the front will be less than your fear of this pain. In Britain, Men were subjected to solitary confinement, humiliation, and sometimes the ultimate punishment, the firing squad for desertion or cowardice. Over 300 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed by their own side. Many were undoubtedly men shattered by shell shock. But amidst this medical and moral failure, a new understanding was painfully born. Pioneering neurologists and psychiatrists like Dr. W.H.R. Rivers at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland began to listen. They stopped seeing symptoms as weakness and started seeing them as a symbolic language. Rivers treated the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who had written a public declaration against the war's continuation. Rather than court-martial him as a traitor, the authorities declared him shell-shocked and sent him to Rivers. Rivers used talking therapy. He understood that Sassoon's madness was in fact a brutal, painful sanity, a moral revolt against the insanity of the war itself. His most famous patient was the young officer and poet Wilfred Owen. Owen arrived at Craiglockhart stammering, haunted by nightmares of the man he had failed to save in no man's land. Rivers encouraged him to write, to translate the unspeakable images into poetry. The result was the most searing, compassionate indictment of war in the English language. "My subject is war, and the pity of war," Owen wrote. "The poetry is in the pity." Therapy for Owen was not about curing him to send him back to the front, which he was, and where he died. It was about giving his suffering a voice, making it communicable. This was the revolutionary idea: the mind could be wounded by experience. Trauma was not a flaw in the man, but a flaw in the event. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was born in the mud of Passchendaele and the consulting rooms of Craiglockhart. The mutiny was not just of the body, but of the soul. The French army, after the nightmare of Verdun and a disastrous Calais offensive in spring 1917, reached its breaking point. Regiments refused to go to the front. They occupied their trenches but declared they would defend, not attack. They sang socialist anthems. This was not a revolutionary political uprising, it was a psychological strike, a collective, unconscious assertion: we are not machines, we break. The French High Command, led by General Pétain, responded with a mix of brutal repression, dozens of executions as examples, and strategic reform, improved rest, better food, an end to suicidal grand offensives. He restored order not just through fear, but by acknowledging, however minimally, the humanity of the poilu. The inner storm was also brewing on the home front, in a different form. The war had promised glory and meaning. It delivered industrialized death and propaganda lies. As the lists of dead grew longer and the promises of a quick victory evaporated, a deep, cynical disillusionment set in. This was the mood captured by the Dada artists in Zurich, a furious nihilistic rejection of the logic and language that had led to the slaughter. If this was the fruit of reason and civilization, then reason itself was a joke. They made art from nonsense because nonsense was the only honest response. The legacy of this inner cataclysm was permanent. The war created a new archetype, the veteran, not the honored whole hero of old, but the haunted hollow man. The man who had seen the abyss and brought a piece of it back with him. He was alienated from those who had not served, from the pre-war world of innocence he could never re-enter. His home was not home anymore. His mind was a haunted trench. This shattered consciousness became the defining term of modernism. The fragmented, stream of consciousness narrative of James Joyce and Virginia Woolf mirrored the shattered, dissociated psyche. The bleak, existential novels of the lost generation Hemingway remarks spoke of a world stripped of grand illusions, no longer sought to represent reality beautifully, but to convey the fractured, terrifying feeling of modern experience. The war did more than kill 10 million men. It traumatized civilization. It injected a pervasive, low-grade anxiety into the cultural bloodstream of the West. The confident, linear narrative of progress was replaced by a stuttering, uncertain one. Faith and authority, military, political, religious, was irreparably damaged. People had seen the maps the generals drew, and they had seen the piles of corpses that resulted. They would never trust a map so blindly again. The greatest casualty of the Great War was not a generation of youth, but the human sense of continuity. The past was now a foreign, naive country. The future was unknowable and threatening. Only the terrible eternal present of the trauma remained. The mind had discovered its own fragility, and having discovered it, could never forget. The trenches broke men not with bayonets, but with endless, anonymous terror, a reality their pre-war minds could not comprehend. Today, what pervasive, chronic realities, algorithmic anxiety, climate dread, digital surveillance, political nihilism are silently reshaping our inner landscapes in ways our 20th century psyches are equally unprepared to process. Where is our shell shock brewing?